So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our program, live from Israel today. My name is Gail Kurtzman, and on behalf of Beth Tikva Synagogue and the Israel Affairs Committee, I would like to thank you for joining us as we welcome back Canadian-Israeli journalist Lauren Izso with special guest journalist Khaled Abu Toameh. Just a reminder that this program will be recorded, so if you don't want to be on camera, please turn off your video. And as usual, if you have questions, please direct them in the chat. I would now like to introduce our interviewer for today, Lauren. Just to remind you, Lauren is a TV host and international news reporter and journalist based in Tel Aviv. She was born in Toronto and studied at UBC Ryerson and Tel Aviv University. She has worked at I-24 News, the Jerusalem Post, and is now a freelancer. And she recently worked as a producer for CNN covering the recent conflict. Lauren will be interviewing our special guest, Khaled Abu Toameh. Khaled is an award-winning Arab-Israeli journalist and TV producer. He is the Palestinian affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and has reported on events in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. He previously served as a senior producer for NBC News and has written for many newspapers around the world, including the Globe and Mail. So before I hand it over to you, Lauren and Khaled, can you please tell us what your lives have been like over the past couple of weeks and update us on what the situation is in Israel today following the ceasefire?
I can sort of start with my experiences and then hand it over to Khaled to sort of give a more precise news update. But essentially, like you said, I was working with CNN covering the most recent escalation. We were actually based in a hotel in Ashdod for like a week and a half, which was, it's quite close to Gaza, quite close to the border. So there was a lot of rockets falling, really close to our hotel. In fact, a rocket fell just right outside of the hotel. There's a video where you can really see, the impact of the rocket. It was a really intense experience, I would say. I was working with Nick Robertson. I don't know if you guys watch CNN regularly, but he was sent here as a special correspondent to cover what was going on. And it was quite a big production. And it was also really intense because there were several times that in the middle of live reporting, we had to, grab all the equipment and run to the shelter. It happened several times. We had several sleepless nights. There were lots of times where we were driving on the highway to, a location to do a report, and we had to jump out of the car on the side of the highway. And, of course, there's no shelter when you're driving on the highway. So you just have to kind of lie down on the side of the highway and cover your head. We spent a lot of time at different IDF artillery positions. And generally, we went to a lot of the places where rockets impacted sort of just after it happened. After we heard about it, we would go there to see the aftermath and do a report there. It was certainly a really interesting experience. I also live in Jaffa, which was a big hotspot of a lot of the tensions between Arabs and Jews in Israel. I'm sure you guys heard about all that stuff going on, all the clashes. And it was certainly the first time I ever experienced anything like that so close to my home. So, like I said, it was definitely a learning experience for me. Khaled, I'll hand it over to you now.
Well, I'm a resident of Jerusalem. And for me, tensions have been very high here since the beginning of Ramadan. That's like more than a month ago. And Jerusalem has been very tense. Many clashes between Palestinians and the Israel police. It started off at the Damascus Gate near the Old City. Then it moved on to Al-Aqsa Mosque, the whole area. That we saw, an escalation later. But I'm used to this. I can't really say that anything surprises me. I've been covering this conflict for nearly 40 years now, 40. I've covered 2 intifadas and I've covered violence and all that, but it's not easy. As someone living in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is a very small city. And, you often find yourself either in the middle of a clash between Israel police and the Palestinians, or While you're driving home, you pass through the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood where all the trouble is taking place right now. But it's a very small city. I mean, the other day on Friday, I was passing near Sheikh Jarrah when a Palestinian rammed his car into the soldiers, into Israeli policemen. I mean, it happened almost in front of my eyes. But as I said, it's a very small city, and you can't really miss it. But you feel the tension all the time. But life continues. What can we do? I'm not only talking as a journalist, but as a resident of Jerusalem. It's not really easy. I move between the two parts of Jerusalem, from Jewish neighborhoods to the Arab part, and you feel the tension. But at the end of the day, I'm still optimistic because I've seen this before. I've seen all this tension. I've seen. I think we even went through more difficult periods. I remember during the second Intifada, which began in 2000. I mean, there were days when we were afraid to leave our homes because of the suicide bombings. And I was living in an area called French Hill, north of Jerusalem, and I had 6 suicide bombings outside my home. And I also had my office in downtown Jerusalem. And I remember, hearing all the explosions and happening, just under your window. But as I said, when you have all this experience and you've been covering the conflict, you stop getting excited, or you just get used to it.
Well, you've certainly been doing it a lot longer than me. You brought up Sheikh Jarrah, which is a really interesting issue. And I feel like a lot of people in the international community aren't really aware of what exactly is going on there, and that this sort of most recent escalation really started with the tensions in Sheikh Jarrah. So maybe you can break down for everyone that's watching what exactly is going on there.
Well, first of all, we're talking about a very small suburb or neighborhood in Jerusalem, which is only 4 or even 3 miles away from the old city of Jerusalem. And it's called Shimon HaTzadik also neighborhood because it has the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik. There are a number of Arab families living there. They rented, or they were moved in by the Jordanian government back in the 50s. These are refugees. They went to the Jordanian government and they said, we don't have any homes. We ran away from Israel proper. So there were a number of empty houses there that did belong to Jews, by the way. There's no dispute that these houses were once owned by Jews before 1948. So the Jordanian government allowed them to move in. Then in 1967, after Israel took over East Jerusalem, some Jewish groups, or in the beginning it was Jewish families, they went to the courts and they said, these houses belong to us. The courts ordered the tenants, the people living there, the Arab families, first they ordered them to pay rent. And the Arab families said, we're not going to pay rent. We've been living here. The Jordanian government gave us these houses. So they refused to pay the rent. And what's funny is that these people are being evicted because they didn't pay rent. It's not because, Jews came there and said, get out of here, it's a technical thing. It's a legal issue. But, in Jerusalem, or when it comes to to disputes between Jews and Arabs, everything becomes a political issue. And the Palestinians succeeded in turning this legal dispute between Jews and a number of Arab families in Sheikh Jarrah into a political national issue. Now, look, I mean, I can almost understand how it developed into this, how the situation escalated, because the way the Palestinians see it is that this is part of an Israeli campaign to squeeze Arabs out of Jerusalem. And that's why the Arab family, or the Arabs in Jerusalem and the other Palestinians, they felt threatened. They felt as if they were being targeted by Israel. Especially that, you know, the legal issue was taken over by two Jewish groups whose declared goal is to settle Jews in that area. And now look where we are. You know, a small dispute has turned into an international issue. I mean, who imagined that the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah would be mentioned by everyone in the media, by the United Nations, by... I don't even see now how Israel can evict them, by the way. Remove these people from there, now that it's become an international issue.
Why do you think it became such a huge international issue and really a really symbolic place for this entire conflict?
Because, look, first of all, because of the media also contributed to this, into turning this issue into a major crisis. Sheikh Jarrah is a nice place to be in, and it's accessible. And many journalists, you know, they just drove there, and there's nothing, I mean, it's a good story. It's a good story. Here are Arab families living, and the Jews want to, you know, kick them out or expel them. So it's seen in that context. Here's Israel trying to kick Arabs out of their home. Here are Jewish settlers trying to take over the homes of these poor Arab families. And you know how the media likes to portray things here with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it looked bad for Israel, and it looked very good for the Palestinian families. In the media, you know, we consider ourselves to be liberal, open-minded, progressive people. And as such, it is our duty to side always with the underdog. And this is a very good case of, you know, the underdog versus the, the Goliath, David, you know. It's like the weak people versus this powerful state, Israel, that is coming there to drag these people out of their homes. And that's why it became an international issue.
So I want to talk about coverage of the conflict and the international press, like you brought up briefly. In terms of the coverage, there was one particular moment that really stood out for me. Was I'm sure you all heard about it. It was when Israel sort of knocked down a building in Gaza. That was where a lot of international press bureaus sat, including the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, and there were others too. And it was difficult for me because it really hit close to home. And also it was a really difficult moment for Israel in the international press. And it just brought up a lot of issues that weren't really, talked about before or delved into that much. I was wondering your reaction as a journalist to covering this conflict, and if there was any particular moment. I'm sure there were many, but anything that stood out to you in your coverage.
Look, I mean, I'm not worried about the buildings as much as I'm worried about the loss of human life, you know, the casualties, the civilians, the poor people living there who get killed. And again, you know, I'm not angry at Israel. I'm angry at those who force Israel to respond to the rockets. I'm angry at those who fire from civilian places in Gaza towards Israel. I'm angry at those who, you know, do not care about the suffering of their own people. I don't even know why we went to war this time. There was no reason for Hamas to fire rockets at Jerusalem or at Israel. The Jews did not destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Jews did not capture it. They did not evict the families out of their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. So what was the reason? There was no reason for all this, for the latest escalation that we saw. And it's very tragic. It reminds me, by the way, of how the second intifada began. I covered that intifada. And I remember the incitement against Israel back then. Ariel Sharon, who was the leader of the Israeli opposition, decided to make a visit to the Temple Mount. It was a very brief visit, by the way. It lasted for like 20 minutes. I was there. But what did Palestinian leadership tell the Palestinians? Oh, our people, rise. The Jews are planning to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Ariel Sharon is desecrating our mosque. And, all this kind of rhetoric. Now, Palestinians reacted, when you hear that your holy site is being desecrated and that the Jews are plotting to destroy it, you take to the streets to protest. And Palestinians took to the streets, they protested, and we found ourselves in the midst of something called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. The Intifada to save the Al-Aqsa Mosque from being destroyed by Israel, by the Jews. 4,000 Palestinians died. More than 1,000 Jews died or were killed during that Intifada, and the mosque is still there. And what we are seeing, or what we have seen in the last few weeks, reminds me, it's actually the same scenario. It's Palestinian leadership once again saying, oh, our people, rise. The mosque is in danger. The Jews want to take it over. The Jews are violently storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Oh, this rhetoric is not good. And this is what led to the latest escalation. It's not only about Sheikh Jarrah, by the way. People think that it started with the eviction. No, it started on the first day of Ramadan when people came out of the mosque and marched towards Damascus Gate near the old city. And the police decided that, they don't want this gathering at Damascus Gate. So the police put security barriers there to prevent people from gathering. Why? Because there are also Jews who passed from there through Damascus Gate on their way to the Western Wall. And the Israel police was worried that this would create friction between the two. And that's how one thing led to the other. Then the whole thing of the whole issue of Sheikh Jarrah came into the middle of it, and it became Damascus Gate, it became Al-Aqsa Mosque, it became Sheikh Jarrah, it became the whole issue of Jerusalem was now on the table. But I'm glad that things have calmed down now. Also in Jerusalem, by the way, and in Gaza. I said I feel very sorry for all the civilian lives, whether Jews, Palestinians. I do not distinguish between a Palestinian child or a Jewish child. It's very tragic. It's very sad that people paid with their lives. And we're back to square one if you think about it. Israel did not remove Hamas from power. They're still there. And Hamas could not drive the Jews to the sea. Hamas did not achieve its goal. They did not liberate Palestine. They did not liberate Jerusalem. They did not drive the Jews out of Jerusalem. So what have you achieved? Nothing. In wars like this, there are no winners. There are only losers. And you know what? I don't care about Hamas. For me, the real losers are those who died, the innocent civilians on both sides.
Well, another kind of fallout that's been coming from this conflict is, of course, we're seeing a lot of a rise in anti-Semitism on a huge level all around the world. There's a lot of clashes, like fights breaking out in the streets between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian people going out to try to support, the cause they believe in. So as a journalist, we all know that the media coverage of this is sort of the disinformation is leading to these kind of things on the streets. So as a journalist, how do you manage that responsibility of a publication that people all around the world read to be able to, tell this story in the right way?
Lauren, I have no doubt. I've actually worked with dozens, if not hundreds, of foreign journalists who came to cover this conflict. I was a stringer producer for many, taking them to Gaza, to the West Bank. And I can tell you today with full confidence that our coverage of the Israeli-Arab conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and our obsession with Israel is one of the reasons why you see this rise in anti-Semitism around the world. Why? Because we wake up in the morning and we search for any story that reflects negatively on Israel. We keep highlighting only the bad things that Israel or Israelis do. And then you see the reaction coming from, all these people on the streets of Toronto, New York, France, and elsewhere. We've even reached a point where sometimes when I meet with my Jewish friends, I tell them, you know what, as a journalist, I want to apologize to you. They say, why? I tell them because our bias, or our anti-Israel bias and our obsession with Israel is promoting anti-Semitism around the world. These people, I call them the Jew haters. Look, they will hate Jews anyway, but we give them, through our coverage, we give them the fuel, the ammunition. They use the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an excuse. I've personally experienced it when I went to visit some dangerous places like university campuses in Canada and in the US. And I met these people. And, I was surprised, first of all. I call them Israel haters or Jew haters. I was surprised, first of all, to discover that most of them were not even Palestinians. I don't know, some of them were from Canada, from the US, others were from Pakistan. But I discovered that many of them were trying to be more Arab and more Palestinian than I am. And when I asked them, what's your message? What do you want? They said Israel is a racist, apartheid, murderous country. Israel, the Jews, apartheid. I said, okay, thank you for telling me, how bad Israel is. But that doesn't make you pro-Palestinian. You're just Israel haters or Jew haters. Because when they describe themselves as pro-Palestinian, I didn't see anything pro-Palestinian about their message. I only heard messages of hate towards Israel, towards Jews. I told them, look, if you really care about the Palestinians, as you claim you do, and I don't believe you really care about them, why don't you do something positive to help the Palestinians? Why don't you, instead of hiding at a university campus in Toronto or elsewhere and spewing hatred against Israel and Jews, why don't you come to Palestine and promote democracy and freedom of speech that we don't have, not under the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and not under Hamas in Gaza? Why don't you, instead of calling for boycotts and divestment and I don't know, why don't you come and organize joint meetings between Jews and Arabs to try to build bridges and not destroy bridges? Why don't you, if you really want to help, why don't you come and teach Palestinian children English, for example, or do something positive for a change? But, I discovered, unfortunately, that it's more about hating Israel. And as I said, we in the media, we also bear responsibility. I'm not saying that Israel should not be criticized. But sometimes, or if I were to sum up my experiences with international media, I would say that we have committed a crime against Israel. And we are responsible for all these violent reactions that we are seeing. And we see it each time there is a round of fighting, between Israel and Hamas and all that. How do we cover these conflicts? By saying, it all started when Israel fired back. And the only pictures we show are pictures of children and buildings being torn down or being blown up. And why? Because Hamas does not allow you to cover, to cover or to work independently in Gaza. And I know what I'm talking about because I was there several times, even when Hamas was there and before that, and I know how it works. So, we in the media should be a bit more responsible. If you want to criticize Israel, that's okay. But, first of all, do it in a very keep things in proportion. But it's also okay to criticize the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. Many of my colleagues don't want to do that, unfortunately. And when I ask them why, they give me all kinds of reasons. Some say, we need to go back to Gaza. It's too dangerous. Hamas might kill us. Others say, we can't criticize the Palestinian Authority because we need to go back to Ramallah. Other journalists, I don't know, they have other considerations. My editor wants this story and not that one. And, maybe one day I'll write a book about it, about all these experiences. But I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed with mainstream media in the West because of this.
I have to say, I completely agree with you. And I don't want to sound insensitive, but there's a saying that people who work in the news often say, which is, if it bleeds, it leads. That's really something that people say in the newsroom. And it just reminds me of sort of how the media is automatically drawn toward the most gruesome, the biggest, most spectacular headlines.
Lauren, until 1995, I was working with progressive liberal newspapers like The Guardian, The Observer, even BBC. I did a number of documentaries with them, Channel 4. And I was also writing in Hebrew for some progressive, liberal, if you want, left-wing newspapers in Israel. I did that for more than 15 years. During that period, when I was criticizing Israel and writing, about the occupation and about curfews and Palestinian suffering, I received 9 international awards. 9. After the signing of the Oslo Accords, when the Palestinian Authority was established, when I started reporting about Palestinian corruption, about Yasser Arafat's repressive measures against his people, and when I later started writing also about what Hamas is doing, first of all, I lost more than 90% of my work with international media, and I can only dream about receiving any award now. And they stopped inviting me to the campuses. Not that I miss them, I'm not gonna go back there, because I told them, last time I was in California, I told them, no, thank you. I'd rather be with Hamas. I feel safer than coming to a university campus in the US or in Canada.
So we talked about, of course, what's happening on the streets of the world, all the clashes breaking out. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog crying in the background. I want to talk also about, of course, we brought up briefly the clashes going on in Israel on the streets of Jaffa, just outside my house, in Jerusalem, in many cities in Israel that have Arabs and Jews living together. So I wonder if you can break that down for us, what exactly is happening there, and whether or not you think that this is threatening the coexistence that exists in Israel.
Look, I'm very worried about the future of relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. With Hamas, we know what the solution is: separation in one way or another. They are there, Israel is here. You can bomb them, you can attack them, but at the end of the day, there is separation between Israel and Gaza. One of Hamas's goals, and Hamas is now boasting about this, by the way, that they have managed to damage coexistence between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. And we must not allow them to do that. Despite all what happened in the last few weeks in mixed cities inside Israel, I'm still optimistic about the future of relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, and I'll tell you why. First of all, a minority of people were involved in the violence. The vast majority of the Arab Israelis are still loyal citizens. And I'm an Israeli citizen also, by the way. We are loyal citizens. We have issues with the Israeli establishment and the Israeli government, of course, but these are issues that any citizen would have, We have no political demands from Israel. Our demands are related to unemployment, public funding, equality, an end to discrimination in various fields and things like that. Those who took to the streets to attack their Jewish neighbors or participated in the violence should be punished. And I have confidence in Israel. Israel is a state of law and order. If anyone broke the law, whether he's an Arab or a Jew, punish him, but avoid collective punishment. And don't make generalizations. Don't punish me, Khaled, the loyal Arab Israeli citizen, because of a number of thugs who attacked a Jewish family. I condemn it. I'm not afraid to say it. I've said it openly. I think those who carried out these violent attacks caused more damage to the Arab community inside Israel than anyone else. But then, there are people among the Arab Israelis who would tell you, look, this is the result of years of negligence on the part of the Israeli establishment. Israel did not fight against violent crime in the Arab sector. Israel did not invest enough. Israel did not put, help in the education. Okay, but that should not be a justification for violence. As I said, yes, relations now between Jews and Arabs inside Israel are tense, but you know what? I have good news for you. 20 years ago, when at the beginning of the beginning of the second Intifada, we also saw a rise in tensions between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. And back then, 12 Arabs were killed by the police. It took some time, but we went back to normal life. We have no other choice but to live together. We work together, we wake up to, we send our children sometimes to the same schools. Things will go back. I'm optimistic about the future, but I would also like to see the Israeli establishment embrace its Arab citizens, not alienate them, as long as we are loyal citizens. And secondly, I would like to see the leaders of the Arab community inside Israel work towards building bridges with the Jewish population and not burning bridges, not destroying bridges. I'm worried because some of the leaders of the Arab community inside Israel have not come out very strongly against the violence that we saw on the streets of mixed cities inside Israel.
I noticed just now that several times you described yourself as an Arab Israeli. I wonder if you also identify as Palestinian.
Well, first of all, my mom is Palestinian. My father is an Israeli citizen. My mother is a Palestinian. I'm Muslim and I'm Arab. And I'm also an Israeli citizen. So, we have a crisis of identity here. But if you want, you can call me Arab, Israeli, Muslim, Palestinian. I have no problem with it. You can call me whatever you want. the way I see myself, I'm an Arab citizen of Israel.
So I want to ask you, there are, many Arabs in Israel that do identify as Palestinian. Why aren't they called Palestinians by the media and by the state? Why do you think that?
I think that it's in order to avoid confusion. Seriously, I've asked many of my colleagues, what do you call? They say, no, if we start telling people that there are Palestinians in Israel and all that, then people will say, well, people living in Canada and in Europe, they don't really know. They hear Palestinian, and they will assume that, Khaled the Palestinian must be under occupation or living in Gaza or in the West Bank. It's more just to avoid the, confusing the readers. When I visited the US for the first time, maybe 15 years ago, and I told people that I'm an Arab citizen of Israel, they were surprised. They said, what? There are Arabs inside Israel, you're not Jewish? I said, no. I said, you know what? Some people even call us Palestinian. They said, what? Can a Palestinian live in Israel? I said, yes. So, it's a matter of terminology. But people abroad don't really know. And I think that most journalists just avoid it in order not to create confusion. But look, there are some Arabs in Israel who use that term for political reasons. It's like, oh, we are part of the Palestinian people and all that. Okay, but why should Israel, worry about this? Let them call themselves whatever they want. If the Arabs in Israel want to call themselves Palestinians, Iraqis, Kuwaitis, at the end of the day, they are Israeli citizens. We should not worry about these things. We should not attach too much importance to it. If someone wants to call himself a Palestinian citizen of Israel, that's good. Why not? I mean, I don't see any problem with it, as long as he is a loyal, law-abiding citizen.
So yeah, speaking of the Arab communities in Israel, aside from what's been happening recently, there has been a lot of violence and crime in these communities over the last years. And a lot of people say that, the government and the police aren't doing enough to stop it. And there's been a lot of protests. There's been some, clashes with police over this. I wonder how much you think the Arab members of the Knesset are really representing, the Arab Israelis, and if you think that they have actual influence on policy.
First of all, I've heard even from Israeli police officers that they're saying we're not doing enough, or we have not done enough in the past. It's no secret. I was talking about negligence on the part of the Israeli establishment in dealing with the Arab community. And one aspect of it is the absence of law enforcement. And this is what happens when there is no law enforcement in the Arab villages and Arab towns. I'm not saying there's no law enforcement at all. I'm just saying there was not enough. Now, I don't know why that happened. It could be because maybe, some people thought, oh, why should we get involved? These Arabs, they have their own traditions, their own culture. Maybe these are clans fighting each other. And I mean, one officer told me, I'm not going to send a Jewish policeman to break up a fight between two Arabs and risk his life. So, there are many reasons, but it's easy to blame Israel and say Israel's responsible, but what about the responsibility of the leaders of the Arab community? I say that there's a problem with education inside Israel, among the Arabs. Education, not schools. I'm not talking about schools. I'm talking about education at home. It's what you hear from your parents. It's what you hear from your leaders. And that's where the Arab leadership failed. Now, the Arab representatives of the Knesset, they have failed their people for a long time. Many Arab Israelis feel that most of the representatives in the Knesset have been affiliated with the PLO, Hamas, or representing the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza more than they are representing the interests of the Arab community inside Israel. And that's why in the last election in Israel, the Arab citizens of Israel punished them. The joint list, which consisted at least back then of 3 or 4 Arab parties, lost nearly half of its power, half of their seats in the Knesset. Why? Because the Arab citizens of Israel told them, we are fed up with you, you haven't done anything, we keep voting for you, you're not fighting for us, we feel that you are fighting for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And many of the Arab Israelis voted for Mansour Abbas. Mansour Abbas, he used to belong to that bloc, that joint list. He broke away, and he actually told the Arab Israelis what I'm saying. He said, it's time for us to take matters into our own hands. I don't want to represent the PLO and Hamas. I want to represent my constituents. I want to work towards bringing more money, public funding. I want to do something good for my people. And that's why many people voted for him. He got 4 or 5, I can't remember, seats.
4, I believe.
Yeah, 4 seats, which is nearly 150,000 votes, which is good. One of the ironies is that the tensions that we are witnessing now between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, they came at a time when relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel were very good. They came at a time when the Arabs in Israel were saying, we want to be integrated into Israel, not separated. Many of the Arab Israelis who voted for Mansour Abbas, they voted for him because he ran on a ticket that said, vote for me, I will fight for integration into Israel. He even said, I want to join the coalition. I want to be part of the decision-making process in Israel, which is good. So the majority of the Arabs inside Israel are fighting for integration into Israel. We want to be part of Israel. We are saying, look, we are not Jewish, but that does not make us an enemy of Israel. Don't judge me according to my religion. Judge me according to whether I'm a good citizen or not. And that's how it should be.
I do want to zoom out a little bit. We don't have a ton of time left, and there are like a few big issues I still want to tackle. Just as all this conflict was starting to escalate, we were just starting to see the fruits of the Abraham Accords, the Israeli peace agreements with Arab countries. I wonder if you think the latest escalation is threatening that at all.
So far, fortunately for us, no. I didn't see the United Arab Emirates recall its ambassador. I didn't see Bahrain recall its ambassador or cut off ties with Israel. And that's good news. But in order to maintain the Abraham Accords, we need the Biden administration to come out in full support of them, to send a message to the Arab world that we are behind them, we support them, we want to see more Arab countries join in. And unfortunately, many Arabs feel that the Biden administration is still sitting on the fence, we say. That it's not really moving, to encourage more Arabs to join. But the tensions between Israel and the Palestinians have so far not affected these peace agreements, and that's good news, by the way. I mean, there are many reasons why. Look, some people in the Gulf are fed up with the Palestinians. They see the Palestinians as being ungrateful. Don't forget that the Palestinians condemned these accords and said that, they even accused the Arab countries of betraying the Palestinians. So tensions between the Gulf states and other Arab countries and the Palestinians have been tense. They've been strained. One of the goals of Hamas and Iran and Islamic Jihad was not only to destroy coexistence between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, but also to prevent other Arabs from engaging in any form of normalization with Israel. And again, we must not allow them to achieve that. And I said, The most important thing is for the Biden administration to send a message that it stands behind these accords. It wants to expand these accords in order to include other Arab countries. That's a very important message that needs to come out.
So speaking of Biden, I'm curious what you think of his reaction to all the recent escalations. If you think he did enough, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on Biden. I was focusing more on the Palestinians. But look, if you ask some Israelis, they are satisfied that he, managed to delay a vote in the Security Council at least 3 times. There was supposed to be a statement coming out of the Security Council condemning Israel, and he kept pushing it. Now, we also hear that the Biden administration played an important role in achieving the ceasefire by by using its good relations with Egypt, with Qatar, so they even sent an envoy here, and then Blinken came here. I don't think that the Biden administration really wanted to be involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because they have their own issues inside America, but they were dragged into this, and now they're involved. But the question is, will they continue with this involvement or will they pull out? The Americans are now saying that they want to maintain or make sure that the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas holds. And we need to wait and see.
So it's interesting because, of course, we had 4 years of Donald Trump. The whole world thought that he would be the last person that would be able to progress any kind of peace process. And now he's out and Biden's in, and it seems like, we're farther than we've been in a really, really, really long time. What is the solution here? What is the thing that's going to get both sides back to the negotiating table?
Both sides, you mean the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Palestinians and the Israelis. Is it going to be the US that's going to get them to the table, or is it going to be another outside force?
Look, I mean, the Palestinian or President Mahmoud Abbas's position is very clear. He's saying, I'm ready to return to the negotiating table with Israel, but only if it's done under the auspices of the international community, specifically the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the quartet members. So he wants an international umbrella. Mahmoud Abbas wants to internationalize the conflict. He doesn't want to sit with Israel alone. He wants all these parties involved because he's hoping that they will put pressure on Israel. Look, what's Mahmoud Abbas's position? His position is, give me 100% of what I'm demanding, or there is no deal. What's 100%? He wants 100% of what Israel took in 1967, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And that's why he does not want to sit with Israel separately at the negotiating table, because you know what? I can even understand him, and I'll tell you why. If your position is, give me 100% or there is no deal, then why should you go and sit at the negotiating table? If you go to negotiate, that means you're willing to make compromise or concessions. And Mahmoud Abbas cannot make any concessions to Israel. Maybe he would love to, by the way, but we all know why he cannot make concessions, because he will be killed. He will be denounced as a traitor.
So what is the status right now of Palestinian elections? And is it possible that somebody will come and replace Abbas? And if that happens, will those policies change?
Well, first of all, there are no elections. There were supposed to be elections on May 22 for the parliament, and on July 31 for the presidency. But you know what? From day one, when Mahmoud Abbas announced the elections, myself, like many others, we were very skeptical about it. No one really believed him, to be honest with you. No one here believed him. Some people said that he did it only because of pressure from the European Union, the largest donor to the Palestinian Authority. Others said that he announced the elections in order to impress the Biden administration. But I think Mahmoud Abbas quickly realized that he had made a mistake. Why? Because he saw his ruling Fatah faction divided, being fragmented. His Fatah faction was supposed to run on three separate lists. One loyal to Mahmoud Abbas, one belonging to Muhammad Dahlan, the Fatah guy living in the United Arab Emirates, and the third one led by Marwan Barghouti, who's in Israeli prison, and Nasser al-Kidwa, a nephew of Yasser Arafat. And for Mahmoud Abbas, this was a disaster. Why? Because if your faction is divided, that plays into the hands of Hamas. Hamas benefits from this division. And Mahmoud Abbas was afraid that we will see a repetition of what happened in 2006 when Hamas won the parliamentary election, mainly because of divisions inside Fatah. And Mahmoud Abbas was searching for an excuse. And he, in the last minute, he remembered that there is an issue of Jerusalem. And he brought up the whole issue of Jerusalem. Oh, Israel is not allowing me to hold elections in Jerusalem. Excuse me, if you were not sure about holding elections in Jerusalem, why did you call the elections in the first place? Why didn't you demand guarantees from Israel and the international community before you announced the election? And the whole issue of Jerusalem, by the way, one of the reasons why many Palestinians don't buy it is because the agreements between Israel and the Palestinians regarding Jerusalem or elections in Jerusalem, they require Israel to open 6 post offices in East Jerusalem to allow Arabs to vote in the Palestinian elections. Now, these post offices can only absorb 6,000 voters. The rest of the Arabs in Jerusalem can go and vote wherever they want in the West Bank, which is 5 minutes away from their homes. So Israel, if you think about it, Israel did not prevent Palestinians from voting. They could have voted. Maybe there was an issue with the 6,000 voters. But, and I mean, what's that issue? The post offices do not open on Shabbat. And the elections, the parliamentary elections, were supposed to take place on Shabbat. So now there's another issue over here. In the past, Palestinians in East Jerusalem did participate in Palestinian elections, in 3 of them. But the majority of them boycotted the Palestinian elections. They did not vote. Why? Because they don't care. They say, well, I'm happy living here in Israel. I don't want to be part of the Palestinian political system. I don't believe in them. So in the last 3 elections we had, only a few thousand Palestinians from East Jerusalem voted, which means the participation of the residents of East Jerusalem in the elections that were just canceled would not have changed the results anyway. But Mahmoud Abbas, as I said, was just searching for an excuse. And, he used the whole issue of Jerusalem as an excuse. Now, because of that, he has lost much of his credibility, by the way, among Palestinians. And when you lose your credibility, who benefits from that? Hamas.
But even though he's losing credibility, it doesn't obviously mean that we're going to go to an election or the Palestinians are going to go to an election, obviously.
Well, I mean, 3 days ago, he told the US Secretary of State that he's still working on holding the elections. I mean, if Mahmoud Abbas really wanted to hold elections, he had 15 years to hold elections. He doesn't need Blinken or someone else to. And I don't think that at the age of 85, he really wants to hold elections. It's not, and he hasn't even resolved his dispute with Hamas in Gaza. He says that he is the Palestinian president. Excuse me, can this president go to Gaza, where 2 million Palestinians live? If he goes there, Hamas will hang him in a public square. He has limited control in the West Bank. Mahmoud Abbas is in power in the West Bank, thanks to the presence of the Israeli forces investment. Thanks to the fact that Israeli soldiers are sitting only a few miles away from his home and his office.
All right, we're really running out of time, and I know Gail probably has some questions from our viewers. So Gail, if you want to pop in.
Sure. Actually, you both answered a lot of the comments that have been coming up, but I have a question. If you could just briefly touch on the role that Iran plays and the possible resurrection of an Iran nuclear deal. What's your viewpoint on that?
Look, without Iran's support, I mean, I'm talking about financial support and military support, Hamas and Islamic Jihad would not have had all these rockets and missiles. Just yesterday, the leader of Hamas came out and said, "We thank Iran for helping us in our war." Iran has been playing a very negative role over here, not only among the Palestinians, by the way, in Lebanon, through Hezbollah, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. And Arabs are very worried. The Muslim Sunnis are very worried about Iran's meddling in their internal affairs. I haven't seen Iran do anything positive in this part of the world. On the contrary, we see that Iran is backing all these terrorist groups, destabilizing security and stability in several Arab countries. And I see many Arabs expressing concern about the plans to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Many Arabs in the Gulf are sitting there and saying, "Hey, what's going on over here? You know, why are you appeasing Iran when it hasn't done anything yet? You know, you need to make sure that Iran stops supporting Hezbollah and Iran stops supporting or giving weapons to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. You need to stop Iran from supporting the Houthis, the Houthi militia in Yemen that is firing at Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is an ally of the US." So many Arabs are a bit worried about all this. I mean, we're not worried about the nuclear bomb as much as we are worried about the appeasement of this regime. This is a very repressive, dangerous regime. And during the war between Israel and Hamas, the recent one, the last one, we saw all the messages coming from the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and the Al-Quds force commanders to Hamas leaders saying, you know, continue. We need to get rid of the Zionist entity. We will support you. We will march on Jerusalem. We will liberate I mean, you know, very bad rhetoric also. So many Arabs are hoping that, you know, those who are negotiating with the Iranians now will take into consideration what Iran is doing, all these bad things. Because what Iran is doing, Iran is undermining moderate Muslims, moderate Arabs, threatening them. And Iran's declared goal, as I mentioned before, is to prevent Arabs from normalizing relations with Israel.
So thank you to both of you for joining us today live from Israel. We really appreciate the diverse perspective that both of you brought to today's discussion. And on behalf of Beth Tikva and the Israel Affairs Committee, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to another program in the near future, again with you, Lauren, because it's important that we have this perspective directly from Israel, because as you both touched upon, we're getting different messages within the media. So this was quite refreshing to hear your perspective. So thank you.
And Khaled, I also wanted to thank you so much for bringing your perspective. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. You're very interesting, that's for sure. And your identity crisis, as you call it, really give you a really unique perspective. So you're a really important voice. And yeah, thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.